Let's start with a word of prayer, shall we? Thank you, Father, for your goodness and your grace, not only to us, but as we look back and we see these Old Testament saints. We marvel at your faithfulness to your people and your faithfulness to your word and your promises. Help us as we come to David, and in particular, his encounter with Goliath, that we would see the way in which these things apply to us in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. I have to tell you that years gone by, I was involved in prison ministry, and I made the mistake of telling a joke in one of those encounters in prison. It wasn't received with hostility, but it didn't receive the laughter that I had sort of hoped for. It was the story about a man who went to prison, and it was his first day, and he was trying to figure out how you sort of conduct yourself, how you behave, and how you get along. And so he sits next to another inmate, and they have this gathering in the courtyard. And as they're sitting there, somebody says, 15. Everybody laughs. This guy's looking at his neighbor and says, what is this? Somebody else says, 22. Big laughter. 37. Another laughter. Well, they get to back to their cells, and he says to his cellmate, I don't understand this at all. What's going on? He said, well, we've been here so long, we know all the jokes. And so we don't bother to tell them anymore. We just number them. So he goes to bed that night. He gets up the next morning, and when they have their gathering around the courtyard, people are calling out numbers again. And this guy thinks, I can get into the spirit of this thing. And he says, 29. Not a soul laughs. So he gets back to his cell that night, and he says to his cellmate, I don't understand. They laughed at everybody else's joke. Why didn't they laugh at mine? He said, well, you know how it is. Some people can tell them, some can't. I feel, they didn't laugh that way, but I sort of feel that way when it comes to these great stories of the Bible. There's a way in which our Sunday school background makes us sort of yawn with, oh yes, Jonah and the whale, Daniel in the lion's den, and we think we know it all. We've told that story so many times, we just put a number to it. Everybody says, I got that one. But it's not really true. We really don't know those stories as well as we think we do. And one of the difficulties, I think, for all of us as students of Scripture is to come to these stories as those who may be reading them for the first time and asking what God has for us. In my prison ministry, I did the story of Joseph a number of times, and it never failed that every time I taught through the life of Joseph, I saw something new that I had not seen before. And so my prayer is that as we look at this text of Scripture, 1 Samuel chapter 16 and chapter 17, that we will see things that we have not seen before, and especially that we will see them in the light of how they apply to us. Now, a word about Saul. Saul has been the star of the show up till this moment in time. He does not look so good where we are. But you remember the story, Saul was the donkey wrangler who, when his father's donkeys were missing, they went looking. Saul was ready to throw in the towel and give up, and his servant said to him, I think I know a prophet nearby. He could probably tell us about those donkeys. The prophet was quick to say, don't worry about the donkeys. They've already been found. I'm here to deal with you on another level. And he anoints Saul to be the king of Israel, to defeat Israel's enemies, especially the Philistines. Saul reigned for 40 years, and he did many great things, and he overcame many enemies, but he made some serious mistakes. In chapter 13, Saul was to wait for Samuel to arrive and give him instructions about how he was to deal with the Philistines. And when the clock ran out, at least in Saul's mind, he decides that he has to go ahead and offer the sacrifices himself and proceed, because all of his men are sort of vaporizing into the hills and even to the enemy. And you remember that Samuel says to him, because of that, because of your disobedience, your kingdom will not last. But it's not his final mistake. His final mistake comes in chapter 15 when he is told to go and to destroy all of the Amalekites, to kill all of the men, the women, the children, as hard as that is for us to grasp, and all of the cattle. So when Samuel arrives, Saul greets him cheerfully and says, "We've done everything you've told us. We've been obedient." And Samuel says to him, "What is this bleating of the sheep I hear?" They hadn't done it all. They had simply killed off the worst and saved the best for themselves. Now, Saul said they did that so they could sacrifice it to God, but I don't really think that's true. And in those sacrifices, they often participated in the meal, so one way or the other, they gained. Now we come to Saul in chapter 16 and 17, and he is certainly not a giant. You remember that Saul was the man who was Israel's Goliath. The text tells us that Saul stood head and shoulders above everyone else in the nation. He was Israel's Goliath. If there was any champion who should stand against Goliath, it was Saul. But that is not going to happen. But let's look at the background and the backdrop to this in 1 Samuel chapter 16. The chapter begins with Samuel grieving over the fact that Saul is no longer going to be the king, that someone is going to replace him. And God says to him in verse 1, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons." And then Samuel says something that I think is pretty significant for us. Samuel says, if Saul hears about this, he'll kill me. I think oftentimes we think that Saul was only a man who was willing to kill David. We know that Saul tried to kill his son, Jonathan, with a spear. And he tried to kill his son when he went to battle. And he did so without permission. It caused trouble for Saul. Samuel knows that Saul is a man who is threatened, and he is dangerous. And so God instructs Samuel to simply go as though he is offering a sacrifice, not telling the full extent of what he's there for. And he comes, and the elders at Bethlehem greet him, and they came to him, it says in verse 4, trembling. Why are they nervous? Because they too fear Saul. They know that Saul knows that he's on his way out. They know that Saul is looking for whoever it is that's going to be that next king, and Saul's going to do everything he can to stop it. And any one of them that meets with that king in Saul's eyes is guilty of treason. It's a dangerous meeting that's taking place, and David hasn't even been on the scene yet. So they say, do you come in peace? And he says, yes, I do come in peace. And he offers the sacrifice. Now, what's interesting is everybody knows what he's there for. Everybody who's present knows what he's there for. He is there to anoint the new king. And Jesse has been invited with his sons. And so everyone knows that it's one of those sons that is going to be designated as the king. What catches them all by surprise is which one of those sons it is. And by the way, take note of this fellow's name, Eliab, verse 6. Eliab is the firstborn. So who would you naturally assume would be the one who would be anointed as the king of Israel? The firstborn. It's the way it always was. He was the oldest. From what we gather, he was probably a good fighter. He was probably physically fit. He probably looked exactly like the part. What a surprise it must have been when God says to Samuel, who thought it was Elias too? Nope, not him. And so the process starts, and they go down the line from one son to the other. Not him. Not him. And they get to son number 7. Not him either. Well, Samuel's beginning to wonder what's going on, because it looks like that's all the sons that Jesse has. But he says to Jesse, is this it? Is this all you have? And Jesse says, well, there's the boy. He's out in the field taking care of the sheep. Now remember, that was something that the young ones did. When I was in India and in other parts of the world, when I would see who was watching the sheep or the goats, it was little kids. You know, that wasn't the top job. That wasn't priority job, big pay work. It was kids' work. And the reality is, David was a kid. 15-year-old kid maybe, but kid. So they bring David in. But the word that Samuel says is important to us. Verse 7, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not a man as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. The Lord is not looking for a man with a big body. That was Saul. He's looking for a man with a great heart. That's David. That's David. So David is brought. He is anointed. And by the way, he's anointed in the presence of all of his brothers. So his father, all 7 of his older brothers understand David has been designated as Israel's king. I take it they probably witnessed the Spirit coming upon David with power as well. That was God's way of designating. It's almost like our Lord Jesus coming up out of the baptism, and remember, the Spirit descends upon him, and it's his way of designating the Lord Jesus. He's my son. In him I'm well pleased. Well, here we are. So David now has the Spirit of the Lord upon him, and we know shortly that the Spirit of the Lord leaves Saul. Spirit of the Lord was given so that David, or the king, would have the wisdom and the power to rule over God's people in a way that was supernatural. So in verse 14, we are told that the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him. I asked people last night how many thought that Saul was a true believer in God. Well, one of the questions that people would raise is, does an evil spirit possess a believer? Certainly possessed Saul. I think I'm willing to look at this text and say, in effect, Saul was demon-possessed. He really was demon-possessed. And so as the story goes on, it's apparent to Saul's servants that something has gone desperately wrong. And they say to him, there's really a need for we need to call in somebody that's sort of a specialist to help deal with this spirit that comes upon him. And I take it that these come at sort of random times, and that all of a sudden you recognize that the man you're talking to is really, literally another man. Remember when Jesus talks to Legion, and the demons actually speak? And oftentimes in the demonized world, they will speak with a different voice. You know that person is really, in a sense, somebody other than that. It seems to me that's the way it was with Saul. And it's interesting, too, that it's music that somehow plays a role in dealing with that demonic presence. Now, that's not unusual. You remember there's a time when the prophet is asked to do something and he says, send for a minstrel. There was something about music that set the stage somehow for the Spirit of God, as well as the exit for this demonic spirit that was possessing Saul. And it says this, let our Lord, verse 16 of chapter 16, let our Lord now command your servants who are before you, let them seek a man who is a skillful player on the harp, and it shall come about that when the evil spirit from God is on you, he will play the harp with his hand and you will be well. Somehow that playing of the harp is assumed to have a calming effect upon that evil spirit. And so Saul says in verse 17, well, provide for me now a man who can do that. Who would that be? Look at verse 18. Here's the fascinating piece. Then one of the young men answered and said, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who was a skillful musician, a mighty man of valor, a warrior, one prudent in speech, and a handsome man, and the Lord is with him. Wow. I thought we were dealing with a 15-year-old kid. Where did this come from? Here's my explanation. I believe that when Samuel anointed David as the future king of Israel, the Spirit of God came upon him at that moment. And from that point on, David began to experience the work of the Spirit in his life, which changed him in such a way that his reputation would go out in this way. Now, here's the way I understand it. I understand the Spirit of God coming upon David. Samuel goes his way. David goes his way, which is back to the sheep. Back to the sheep. And it's clear in the text in both chapter 17 and in chapter 16, David goes back and forth from the sheep. I take it that that's where David begins to see and to grasp and to trust in the power of God. So think about this. Here's David, 15-year-old, goes back to the flock, and one day a lion attacks, and he starts to drag one of the sheep away from the flock. And David offers up a prayer, sort of like Peter when he's sinking in the water. It's not a long one, but sort of, Lord, help me. And in that moment, David realizes the Spirit of God that's come upon him has given him power, like the power of Samson, who tore apart a lion. And I think David takes that lion and literally tears it apart in the power of God. And David says to himself, whoa, this is not the shepherd I used to be. And by the way, when David talks about lions and bears, he doesn't talk about a lion and a bear. He talks about lions plural, bears plural. I take it that during that period of time that David's out tending the flocks, he's experiencing God's miraculous power. And it's the very thing that prepares David to face down to a big-mouthed Goliath. Now, here's what happens. David has already, in whatever period of time that is, he's already begun to be known as somebody who's powerful in speech. In other words, who manifests the Spirit of God. But he's still a teenager. But the question before Saul's counselors is this. What do we do to calm this guy down? It must have been terrifying to be in Saul's presence when he was demonized. And so they said, well, you need this guy. And somebody said, well, it's David. David's the guy that can do that. He's a great musician. He speaks well. He's a mighty man of valor. He's already begun to be distinguished as a shepherd boy. And from that point on, David goes back and forth from his sheep taking care of the sheep, coming to take care of Saul. One of the problems that I have in dealing with chapter 17 is Saul asks the question, who is this? Whose son is this man? Remember, after David has taken on Goliath, that looks like Saul doesn't know him, which sounds a little strange. But every evidence is that chapter 17 and chapter 16 are very tightly related. David doesn't speak in chapter 16, but he does in chapter 17. We find out what a man with a heart for God looks like. How do you explain that? Well, if David is coming and going between his flocks and King Saul, then what is it that causes them to call for him? Here's the way I read the text, the way I understand it. Saul is demonized by a spirit, and he's in a fit. And somebody says, call for David. And David goes off and comes in. And at that point in time, he starts playing his harp and whatever. And it seems to me that there's almost this encounter between the Spirit of God in David and this evil spirit in Saul, and the evil spirit has to go. But I think when Saul is in that state of demonization, I think that he's a different person. And it doesn't surprise me that Saul has no recollection of who David really is. He's another guy. At least that's my one way of explaining it. The other thing is this. He doesn't ask, who is this boy? He asks, who is this man's father? Now, his father was an old man, didn't get around much, so he wouldn't have been around the palace much. But the other thing that Saul had offered in chapter 17 was he will have no taxes. And so what he may be saying is, let's get this guy's father's name down because we got to write him off the tax rolls. That's what he promised. Okay, back to chapter 16. So here's David now going back and forth, attending Saul, verse 21, and it says, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. Now, folks, you had to be 20 years old to go fight in the battle. That's why he wasn't there and his 3 older brothers were. He was not of age, the age to fight. When they numbered the Israelites who could fight, 20 and above. David's below that. But even at that young age, David is somehow noted by Saul as really being one that he can trust and one who is a mighty man of valor, and therefore he has him as his armor bearer, you might say, as an illegal, underage kid. But because of the Spirit of God, Saul recognizes it. So every time the evil spirit comes upon Saul, David brings his harp, puts him at ease. What I'm trying to suggest is that period between the time that David is anointed by Samuel and that time that David faces Goliath, many things take place which evidence the power of the Holy Spirit in his life, so that other people see that and recommend him to Saul, and Saul himself recognizes that. These were not wasted days. Now, I was thinking about this last night, saying to myself, okay, I don't think a donkey herder sleeps outside of the barn with the donkeys, Saul. But a shepherd sleeps with his sheep. And as his brother would say, that little flock of sheep. But it's somewhere out at a distance. He's by himself. That's why he has to defend himself when a lion or a bear comes along and tries to take one of the flock. What do you think David is thinking about as he lays there at the night, looking up at the starry sky by himself? David, the man on whom the Spirit of God now rests. Tell me some things you think he'd be thinking about. Yes. Okay. So when we read in the Psalms where he talks about God in Psalm 19, looking at his creation and all of that, Here's Saul with the Spirit, David, with the Spirit of God on him, and he's looking at this guy and saying, wow, what a great God! Right? And when you think of that great God who created all these things, and here's one loudmouth big boy over here, who wins? God wins. And it's clear that David has a great delight in the law of the Lord. I would say to you, when he's laying there in the fields in the middle of the night, he's thinking about God's law. And he's thinking about God. He's thinking about who he is. He's thinking through the Old Testament up to that point. He's thinking about Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Maybe thinking about Judges. He's thinking about God. I think the other thing that I see in all of that is he has to be thinking about Saul. I mean, he's out tending the flocks. Crisis comes, he goes and plays, and Saul is calmed down, and he goes back out to his flocks, and he says to himself, what is this all about? David is introduced to the spiritual warfare as a teenage boy, and he's right in the thick of it. And all of those things had to enter in, but there's one more piece. David came and went into the king's royal court. Is that not right? I mean, when David came, it wasn't, who are you? What are you doing here? It was like, oh, thank goodness, he's here. You know, there he is. Bring the harp and let's get going with David. He had free access to the king. What do you think God was doing in all that? David was waiting. God was working. It was preparation. Think about this. David is going to be king. How do you do that? Well, David's in the royal palace, working with the king himself, seeing how a king works. It's on-the-job training, folks. It's like Joseph when he's taken down to Egypt and he's made a slave in Potiphar's house. He has to learn Egyptian because that's how he's going to lead the nation of Egypt. Then he's put down in the prison with the political prisoners, right? Butler and the baker, political prisoners close to the king. And he gets to find out all about that. God's doing on-the-job training. What I would say to you from chapter 16 is God does not waste his time or ours. He uses it. And I would suggest to you that all of those things that make up your package of who you are, all of those experiences, God has designed in such a way that it will prepare you for the job that he has in days to come. As I look back in my life, there were a lot of things that people might have shaken their heads about and wondered and said, how will that ever fit in? The reality is they have all fit in. 16-year-old boy standing beside my mother when a speeding car takes her leg off, standing next to me. We just were up with my mom. She's 94 years old, still one leg. That shaped my life in many ways. I confess, when I'm standing outside and I see somebody that may have some handicap or difficulty of some kind, I automatically go to the door to open it. Because that's what I always did. I'm looking after mom. God prepared me in that way. My dad was not a good mechanic. I took everything apart, and eventually I started putting it back together again. It was through my leaning over a fender in our back driveway that brought my neighbor Dan across the alley over to see how I was doing. Every time I opened my garage door, he had the signal and he was there. When I built the storage shed so it blocked his view, it was a problem. Dan had to come over and check for himself to see whether I was there. In Dan's last days of life, he called and he said, I want to hear about Jesus. He'd been hearing about it as we'd been talking over the fender. It was that mechanical thing which God somehow used. And so when people would come in and ask where the preacher's house were, they would say, oh, you mean the guy that works on Volkswagens? He lives right over here. They all knew. That was my entree. God uses your circumstances, even the tragedies of your life, to somehow shape you. And it's in the midst of those, when you see the hand of God and the power of God, that you say, I can trust God. I trusted him here, I'll trust him again. Now to chapter 17. And I'm going to look at my watch too. All right, here's the Philistines, and they're gathering their armies. This is a really strange scene. Now remember, the Philistines were huge in number, like the sand of the sea. So the Philistines occupy the land of Israel. They really dominate. They have garrisons that are stationed throughout the nation to make sure that the Israelites don't revolt. They don't allow the Israelites to have any weapons like swords. Remember, only Saul and Jonathan had swords. So here are the Philistines in this huge number, and here they are. On one mountainside are the Israelites. On the other mountainside are the Philistines. And every day for 40 days, morning and evening, by my count, that's 80 times. This is time 81 that now Goliath is going to come. So David arrives, and he's going to find these guys. Here they are facing off, and here's this big-mouthed giant who I think keeps getting closer and closer, stepping out, tempting somebody to come. That somebody should be Saul. But why don't the Philistines just fight? They got many, many more people. They got chariots, they got spears, they got swords. They got all the weapons of warfare. Why in the world don't they just fight? Anybody want to venture a guess? The mountains. It's the mountains. Do you remember when the Syrians came along and there was this battle and the Israelites defeated them? The Syrians said, well, the reason is they serve the God of the mountains. What we've got to do is restage this fight and fight them on the plains. The Philistines had great weaponry, but they didn't have ATVs, didn't have four-wheel drive. And can you imagine, folks, when you read, we read this thing about Goliath and we say to ourselves, whoo, what a huge guy, who would ever take him on? But think about it. Can you see Goliath with that heavy spear, all of that armor on him? Can you see him climbing a mountain going after his enemy? It ain't going to happen. He's great in the plain when people are attacking him. He is not elsewhere. Do you remember when Absalom has rebelled against David, and David's men go out to fight against Absalom and his men? The text says this to us. More people were killed by the forest than were killed by the sword. It was a dangerous place, folks. And you don't go into that dangerous place with hundreds of pounds of metal strapped to you. Philistines were equipped to fight on the plains. The Israelites were lean, and they were off in the hills. Yes, they were guerrillas of sorts, but as long as they stayed on the hills, they were relatively safe too. So this thing went on day after day. Goliath comes out, yells insults at Israel's God, dares somebody to come down and take him on, but neither army is going to budge because they're safe when they don't fight. Now, what about Saul? Isn't it clear that Saul is the giant? Isn't it clear that he's the one God has appointed to lead Israel to defeat the Philistines? Why is Saul out sitting under a tree sipping iced tea? Well, let me give you one suggestion. Well, obviously, A, he's scared. And it's clear that because Saul is scared, all of his army is scared. You remember in the Old Testament, God said to the Israelites, when you go to war, if you have a young man who has just bought a house or a young man who's just married, he doesn't go to war for 1 year. He gets to enjoy what he's gained. In other words, that young man, if he goes out to war, he's going to be thinking about his girlfriend back home. He's not going to have his mind on the war. So God says, leave him home. Give him a year. And it also says, if a man is frightened, send him home. We don't need men amongst our troops who are afraid to fight because they affect all the others. That was Saul. Saul was afraid to fight. Why? I think part of the reason, probably a good part of the reason, is this. Saul knew that his days were numbered. He knew that his kingdom would end. And I think he feared it would end in battle. So you say to Saul, yeah, get right out there, Saul, because God may take you down in this battle. Saul saying, no thanks. I'll sit here and sip iced tea because it's safe. And by the way, Saul was killed in battle. Saul's fears were not wrongly founded. So here you have this scenario that so far has nothing to do with David. And then we read what takes place from there. Here's David, verse 12 and following. 3 of his brothers are old enough and apparently good warriors enough. They are out with Saul fighting. Father's elderly. He really can't make trips back and forth. And so he says to David, as a sort of messenger boy, why don't you just go take some provisions, some food, some cheese and whatever, take it out, because obviously you got to make provision for the guys who are fighting. Take this food out, and while you're there, see how your brothers are doing and bring me a report back. It's a simple messenger boy task. You can make anything about it. Or so it seemed. It was simply David going about the routine of his life, obeying his father, doing as he was instructed, that leads to this whole encounter with Goliath. So it says, David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's flocks in Bethlehem. But when his father says to take those provisions and go, David rose up early in the morning. And just perchance, one of those strange coincidences of the Bible, just perchance he arrives at the camp just at the moment where the 2 armies muster and start to go out and yell and holler at each other, and Goliath's going to get right in the middle. In other words, they've gone back to their tents, they've gotten a good night's rest, they've had their breakfast, and now, it's 9 o'clock, whoops, we got to go to war again. And so off they go to create their front lines, and every time, here comes Goliath out. And I think every day, this is not in the text, every day Goliath probably gets a little louder, a little nastier, and he probably comes out just a little closer to the Israelites than he did the day before, daring somebody to come get him. And he says the solution to our problem is not for all of us to fight, it's for 2 of us to fight. And winner takes all. I love that expression. When my dad was alive, we used to play different kinds of games, dominoes and whatever. And when I would lose, I'd say to him, hey, Pop, let's do another game, winner take all. Because I had to win somehow, and that was the only way it was going to happen. That's what Goliath said, winner take all. If I lose, you win, we're done. So he said. And if I win, you lose, it's over. 2 men fight to the death, it's done. So David is there, and he's listening to all of this. And as he sees Goliath come forth, he sees the fear in all of the Israelite troops. He sees it. And then somebody says to him, do you know that Saul has offered a huge reward to somebody who will just take this guy on? He's offered him freedom from taxes. He's even offered his daughter. I think, I'm not sure this is true, but I think maybe the ante goes up as time goes on. Maybe Saul keeps adding benefits until he thinks somebody will take him up on it. But David says to the guys around him, am I hearing this right? Here's this big mouth blasphemer against God, this uncircumcised Philistine who ought to be taken out, and there's a reward for doing it? You know, it's like somebody saying, I love this job, and they even pay me to do it. That's what he's saying. He's amazed. Now, that's when his brother, Eliab, comes along. Verse 28. Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? You've abandoned your duties. I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart. You have come down in order to see the battle. He was wrong, by the way, on every count. Wrong on every count. Had he abandoned his sheep? No, the text says when he found someone to care for the sheep, he came. Did he come on his own based on his curiosity? No, he came in obedience to his father to bring food and supplies and take a report back to his dad. Was this the wickedness of David's heart? No. Okay, so what's Eliab's problem?
Jealousy.
Yeah, he's the oldest brother. It's jealousy in the sense that Eliab is the guy who thought he was going to be king. He was going to get the Spirit of God. And this kid, who isn't even in the group, is out taking care of that little flock of sheep. He's the guy. There's, I think, another reason. David has been sent to go and give a report. What would your report be if you went back at that moment in time, just turned around, went back to your father? What would you tell them, not only about the Israelite troops, what would you tell them about how your brothers were doing? Well, David would have told the truth. He'd have said, my brothers are shaking in their boots. Goliath has dared anybody to come, just like everybody else. They're not doing it either. They're scared to death. And they've been there 40 days. And I don't think Eliab really wants David going back and making this report, because they look bad. And it's hard for Eliab to really grasp what's going on. I don't think he sees this at all through a divine lens. So anyway, David finally asks again, you know, am I hearing right? Is this really what's going to happen? The guy that takes on Goliath or whatever? And word gets up to Saul. And Saul sends for him. Now, this tells you how desperate Saul is, right? He needs a champion. He needs somebody who'll take on the greatest fighter in the Philistine army. And a teenager who isn't even old enough to fight is called to talk to Saul about it. Look what David says. He says in verse 32 of chapter 17, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and will fight with the Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth. He's been a warrior from his youth. I think he's saying, you're not only young, you're inexperienced. You don't know how to take on a guy like this. He's been doing this for years. It's probably one of Saul's nicest moments. Don't you think? It really is one of those times when Saul seems to care about somebody other than himself. But the other side of it is, if it's winner take all, do you think Saul really wants to bet everything on David? I don't think so. He's saying, winner take all. I'm sending a teenage kid to take on a giant. That makes a lot of sense. Anyway, here's what David says, and this goes right back to chapter 16. Verse 34. Your servant was tending his father's sheep, When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went out after him and I attacked him and I rescued it from his mouth. When he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and I struck him and I killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the enemies of the living God. David's not looking at this through the eyes of how tall Goliath is, how many pounds his armor weighs, how many men he's previously killed in battle. He's looking at this from a divine point of view, and he's saying, yeah, he's big. His mouth is the biggest part of him. He's blaspheming our God and our armies that God has purposed and promised to bless. I think my God's big enough to take him on. Now I want to do just a quick pause for a moment. At this point in time, if you were reading through the Bible, in a year or whatever your period of time was, and you had just gotten to 1 Samuel chapter 17, what would be the big picture? What would be the lens through which you would see this event, Goliath, defying the armies of God? Well, as early as Genesis chapter 12, in the Abrahamic covenant, God says to Abraham, those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. Goliath's on pretty dangerous ground, folks. And that's just for starters. Then you get to the Exodus. God says to Moses, now Moses, a fugitive, by the way, he says to Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to stand before Pharaoh and to tell him to let my people go. Remember what Pharaoh says? Who in the world is the God of Israel that I should obey him? 10 plagues later, Pharaoh got a little smarter. I heard somebody say one time, what would you say to Pharaoh when he asked you that? He said, well, it'd be a little embarrassing to say, well, Pharaoh, you see, I was talking to this bush. That'll go over well. He was. But the reality is, it was the greatness of God. And so when you see the destruction of the entire Egyptian army, friends, they did nothing. The Israelites did nothing. They had no weapons. They stood and they watched God act. So then they come through that. Remember,